Security is too weak, or it's not mature enough. It's too expensive. There's too many legal, regulatory risks to doing it. Enterprise apps can't be conveniently migrated. Each of these are statements or argument I found in several articles dated between 2009 and 2012, arguing against not multi-cloud, but against cloud computing itself. Facts and Factors, a marketing research company, recently published a report citing that cloud computing market was estimated at $321 billion in 2019 US money, and is expected to be over $1 trillion by 2026. According to Computer World UK, 80% of organizations are predicted to migrate between the cloud hosting or co-location services by 2025, 80%. It's safe to say those concerns from 2009, 2012 have been addressed. Today, the discussion isn't about whether we should be considering cloud. The discussion is about hybrid, multi-cloud operating models and how we should be leveraging them. A cloud guru had a recent State of the Cloud Learning report, found that 75% of shops are using AWS as their primary cloud provider, but the same 75% also had workloads running in other clouds. So what is meant by multi-cloud? How are enterprises leveraging multi-cloud? That's the topic for today's discussion. Hello, my name is Wes Rice, and this is the first of 2 InfoQ webinars today. We will be diving into multi-cloud microservices separating fact and fiction. Full transparency, in my day job, I work for VMware as platform architect and solution engineer on Tanzu, which also very much targets this space. I'm joined, however, by an amazing group of industry experts. I'll let each of them introduce themselves in just a moment. Before we do, I wanted to kind of set a little bit of ground rules. And so basically what we'll do is there is a chat dialog box. By all means, ask your questions. Anything that you have that comes up, ask them. I have a set of questions that I will be working from, so I'll try to weave these in to keep the kind of conversation going, but we definitely want to kind of engage the audience. So by all means, please ask your questions. So I want to thank each of you all for joining us, and I want to thank Instana for sponsoring this webinar. With that, I'm going to have each of our panelists introduce themselves. So what I'd like to do is have you kind of tell a little bit about your background, and then when I say multi-cloud, what comes to mind? What types of things do you start to immediately think about? And then what we'll do is we'll take those things and we'll try to shape our conversation around these particular ideas. Richard, you're in my top left. Would you mind introducing yourself and tell me what comes to mind when I say multi-cloud?
Yeah, lucky me. Hey, Wes, thanks for having me here. So yeah, my name is Richard Stroder. I'm a director of product management at Google Cloud. Came here from VMware and Pivotal and companies like that beforehand. I'm also an InfoQ editor. I do training for Pluralsight. Used to be a Microsoft MVP for Azure till I took the pill and joined Google. And then I spend too much time on Twitter, so you can find me in lots of places. What do I think of when you say multi-cloud? I mean, the word that comes to mind to me mostly is misunderstood. And I think because to one hand, like there's an extreme that says multi-cloud is awful and all of those people are terrible people who hate cats and everything. Like there's an extreme end of multi-cloud is terrible because who would build apps that span clouds? Like that's nuts. Latency, performance, security. And so there's a straw man argument that multi-cloud means apps that get spread across clouds, and it seems kind of silly. Now there's the other side though that maybe is a little extreme that says, well, let's just build write once, run anywhere, right? That we can just build clouds that treat the whole cloud as a utility service. And therefore, let's just make it all commodity. All the apps can run everywhere, no code changes. This is amazing. Obviously, there's something in the middle there. And so it just seems like we all kind of mess up the narrative by hitting both of those extremes sometimes. So hopefully even our chat today, we find something that's a little more practical and pragmatic.
Bastian.
Hi, thanks for having me. Yeah, my name is Bastian Spanenberg. I'm currently working as the head of SRE for Instana. I have a background my initial background is software engineering. I was a software developer, software engineer, but soon in my career, I started to look more at the whole picture, building and delivering products, operating products, automating infrastructure setup. So somehow over time, when I was still working in consulting, I was going towards this continuous delivery, DevOps, SRE topics more and more. yeah, and now I'm working in this field. And when I think of multi-cloud, the first word that comes to my mind was complexity. So I like the misunderstood word by Richard, actually, because as he said, a lot of, especially marketing people, try to paint the picture that, yeah, multi-cloud is will solve all our problems. We can move workloads seamlessly between clouds. And coming from a more technical background, I tend to see the complexities and the problems that come with that. And yeah, so I'm curious what the others will have, what take the others will have on that.
Hey, hi. So my name is Edith, and I'm the founder and CEO of Solo.io. Before that, I worked in a lot of startup companies that got acquired by VMware and Verizon. And after it, I worked in EMC as the CTO office, as well as the cloud management CTO. But in generally on the last, I don't know, probably 7 years, I'm working in open source. Everything that related to, right now we are focusing on service mesh like STO and other service meshes, Envoy contributing a lot to there and so on. So that's the stuff that we're focusing on today. And as part of doing this, we actually we see a lot of customers on the field. Service mesh is kind of like a buzzword right now, and therefore everybody are interested of talking about that. And what I see is that multi-cloud in general is something that every company has to offer, in the point that they all offering their division to go to a multi-cloud environment, and they will basically allowing them to have agreement with each of them. But in the nutshells, you rarely see a group leveraging them both. So like if, for instance, they have the ability to go to the big 3 ones, I think that, we have a lot of type of customer, from the small to the big one. And I will argue that besides one of the really, really big companies, but huge company, that I will say that they have only one of the group has over 40 data center. Most of them are basically focusing on one of the cloud and building everything to it. And they like the fact that they maybe can use the other one, but nothing in their software is allowing that, right? Like there's no this mobility between them. So that's what we see, at least. And yeah.
And Armin?
Cool. My name is Armand Dadgar. I'm one of the co-founders of Hashicorp. And our focus is generally cloud infrastructure automation, but very much with a bent in terms of how do we span these multiple environments. I love, Wes, that you started with sort of almost quoting I guess the contrarians of 2009 of why not cloud, and in some sense I think you're right that we see the same sort of critique now of multi-cloud. I think from our vantage point, certainly from the Hashicorp customer base, our view is every major, call it Fortune 2000, will be a multi-cloud company. I think we'll get into it later as to why, what are the reasons and motivations, but our thesis is very much that you will be, whether by choice or by accident. Yeah. And so I think in many ways that HashiCorp sort of focus as a result of that is, okay, great, if you're going to be operating in that way. I think the word that comes to mind for us is fragmentation. Everything's API driven, everything's software driven, but there's no standards. There's really no interoperability between any of these environments. So if you're going to span on-prem and multiple cloud vendors, it's a highly fragmented landscape. How do you do that in a way that you have some sort of common operating model? So that's very much kind of the HashiCorp focus of how do we bring that common operating model and address the sort of fragmentation that we see in the market. But I tend to agree that it feels sort of obvious that where we're going is every big business will be a multi-cloud business.
So I got words like misunderstood, complexity, fragmentation, inevitable. That this is the direction, whether it's through purchases or whether it's from actual need in multi-cloud, it's almost inevitable that we're going to go there. Is this just a tooling problem? Do we just need better tools to be able to multi-cloud, or what's the reason, Richard, that there's all this middle ground that isn't being addressed by what we're doing today?
I don't know. I mean, as you say, the reasons for this, like I talked to a game company a couple of weeks ago, and if you look at most game creators now, Like if you're going to go on Xbox, you get Azure credits. If you're going to go on Stadia, you get GCP credits. You're going to go Luna, you get AWS credits. Like a game company's never going to be single cloud at this point because there's financial incentives. There are other companies that purposely spread them out for risk purposes or geo purposes or different services. So I'm a believer that the multi-cloud that makes sense today is kind of right cloud, right app. You know, if you make great choices, you'll be all in on GCP. I guess that's my only plug. But like normal people are going to use a lot of different types of services because GCP is amazing at some stuff. Azure's great at certain things, AWS as well, let alone the DigitalOceans and Node and other things. Like we're going to have lots of stuff. Gartner said it kind of in a nice way. It's not about data centers anymore. It's about centers of data. And so when you think about when I'm putting compute close to data, I'm thinking about distributed compute. I think the hard part is most haven't played that out totally in their head yet. And so are we missing a magic tool? I don't think so. I think a lot of this is architectural. Some of this is continually thinking about how are you doubling down on the right programming skills, that you're building distributed systems, that they're fault tolerant, that aren't all tightly coupled, that can actually be running in different places. So I don't think there's some cloud management platform that's going to solve all this. Personally, I work on Anthos, so clearly we're trying. But there's something that there's more to it than that. To me, it's architectural. It's a skills-based thing. It's exciting. But I think if we're going to cross this chasm and make multi-cloud truly successful for most people, we're going to have to think about the skills we need to do it first.
Right. Armin, when we talk about multi-cloud, do we just mean one of the major cloud providers? When we talk about cloud operating models, common operating models, I think is the phrase that you used. Are we just talking about like the major providers when we talk about multi-cloud? Let's try to define this.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. In fact, I think we need to bring private cloud into the discussion too. I think when we talk about it, I think it's easy, especially, to just kind of write it off and be like, yeah, obviously everything's going to public cloud. But the reality is when you go and talk to some of these Fortune 50 companies, they have, 200,000 machines spanning 80 data centers, right? Like their investments are, in the billions and billions of dollars. So, I think it's difficult to just write all of that off as well. So, I think the way we talk about kind of cloud operating model is it's really about sort of cloud as a process, cloud as a sort of way of thinking and architecting, less of as a location. So in that sense, I think you can think about on-premise as a, if you want to call it a cloud endpoint, it's a different way of working there than traditional data center, but I think you can treat it like a cloud. Yeah, I think that when you talk about public cloud, I think then the challenge there is really a question of like, the capital expenses required to be a major player today is not for the faint of heart. If you're looking kind of the earnings report, of all the major players, right? You're talking about billions and billions in CapEx. So I think the reality is there's only a handful of players that they're able to operate at that league when we talk about sort of, where public cloud is going.
Yeah. Aded, any thoughts?
Yeah, so I think that a few things. First of all, I totally agree that we still see a lot of on-prem kind of like, cloud, and I think this is important to bring it to the table. I also think that, all the cloud that we use, the big three ones, right, is the Google of the world, the Amazon of the world, and the Azure. I think that in the nutshell, ideally, right, everybody will want, exactly like Richard said, to leverage the right solutions or the right services that exist on the different cloud. The real thing is that it's coming with, there is always a trade-off, right? I mean, if you will build your own infrastructure to actually be allowed to run everywhere, that would be extremely more expensive than actually just said, I'm going to focus on one. I know what it is, it's perfect fit. That's the only thing that I will test, that's the only thing that I will, it's just way simpler. So this trade-off have to become, and you ask yourself the question, why should I support more than one? And that's the real question. Is that a finances question? Is that because you don't have services in other places? Is that because you want to fail over between them? I don't think we see. But you know what I mean? This is the real question, in my opinion. Like, why would you want to go with more of them? And what was the motivation? Because it is expensive and coming with a.
Let's actually talk about that a minute. Armin, I remember I read a post, or I think a video. It was a video discussion when I was prepping for this with you and Mitchell, talking about why people are talking about multi-cloud. What is that? Why are people driving towards multi-cloud?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I think to Edith's point, in some sense, you need a compelling why, because there is a real cost and there's a real sort of complexity curve there. I think from what we've seen that there's a few really practical, real world things. You decide to go all in on GCP, let's say, you buy a company that went all in on AWS, welcome to multi-cloud.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So, I think there's a certain level of large business they do M&A at, all the time. And, great, if you only have 3 or 4 major cloud providers to pick from and you're doing a lot of M&A, you're going to end up at all of the above, right? Like it's just a matter of time. So I think that's one really practical reason that you see. Another one, it goes to the kind of credit conversation earlier. Like, great, you spend $20 million a year on Oracle database licensing. Guess what? You're gonna get a sweetheart deal on Oracle OCI, right? And so if you're like, I can save 50% of my Oracle licenses, and what do I care where they're running? You're gonna be an Oracle cloud, right? And so I think you see that sort of ELA conversation play out, whether you're, a Microsoft customer, IBM customer, Oracle customer, et cetera. There's this sort of transitioning of you have existing spend, we want to move you to our cloud. There's an economic motivation to do that. And then I think you get into sort of like the regulatory stuff, right? So if you're a UK bank, your regulator has told you, unless you operate in 2 different cloud providers, you're not going to cloud. Okay, great, you're going to enable multi-cloud, right? So I think there's a lot of these different sort of very practical things. You're either driven through a regulatory regime, you're doing M&A, right? You have these sort of other practical concerns. You need to operate in whatever, Germany, you need a specific region, and maybe only, Azure has what you need there, or whatever. There's a bunch of these reasons. You want to sell to government, you need to be in GovCloud, et cetera, right? So there's a bunch of these, I think, really practical reasons that just sort of force you there, whether or not you necessarily want to. But I think with all of those things, if you kind of step back, you're like, they're kind of things that affect big companies by and large, right? You don't talk about startups that have complex regulatory regimes generally. So I think that's why it's like, it tends to be, I think you see the split of like the very biggest companies are sort of multi-cloud almost by definition versus, yeah, if you're a startup in a smaller business, like why would you take that complexity on in sort of an optional way?
Bastian, I'm curious, you manage SREs, you're an SRE. When people start talking about multi-cloud, and like Armin just mentioned, you just purchased another company, welcome to multi-cloud. What starts to go through your mind when you need to help work with developers and teams that are now all of a sudden in a multi-cloud environment?
It's currently the other way around for us. We have been acquired by IBM, so a lot of IBM people are talking to me about multi-cloud strategy at the moment. I want to get back one step and want to add one thing to the implications of multi-cloud, because another thing I see is it depends a lot on your business model, and if you're an enterprise company like we are, the point that Armin mentioned is really a very valid point. A lot of people have big deals with cloud providers, and they might have credits, they have committed spend. So you want to offer your service to the customer where he is. So that's another point for us. For example, why we run multi-cloud, we want to be, for one, close to the customer, and it's often also way easier to do a deal with a customer if he's already on the cloud, if he has a committed spend, he has credits, and you're in the marketplace. You have quicker deal cycles, so to say. So for enterprise companies, I think that's a very big point too.
Sure. Let's actually come back to the observability SRE question, because I want to keep going with this just a little bit. I'll go back to you again, Armin. But there was another article that I read where you and our Hashicorp talked a bit about workload portability, data portability, traffic portability, workflow portability. And I really like that, because it starts to kind of segment a little bit on some of the things that are really good targets for multi-cloud and things that are at least a little bit longer pole in the tent. Could you talk a little bit about what's meant by workload, data, traffic, and workflow portability?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought it up, and I think this is I think Richard did a great job at the beginning talking about like multi-cloud isn't a binary, right, where you have these sort of extreme points. I think that it is the spectrum, and I think those are where we kind of talk about these 4 sort of, I guess, checkpoints maybe along this sort of spectrum of multi-cloud, where I think on one extreme, sort of I'll call it the simple extreme, is where you just have what we call sort of, when we talk about data portability, the way I see it is like there's 2 ways to think about data portability, right? One is what I'll call an insurance contract, which is I'm going to put all my data in MySQL in Google, let's say. If I decide tomorrow, whatever reason, I want to move that to Amazon, let's say, great, I can spin up a MySQL in both regions. I can do a SQL dump, I can do a SQL import, but it's this sort of expensive one-time data move, right? So you can think about it as almost this sort of option, right? By picking MySQL, I have this sort of option contract. It's cheap for me to pick the option, right? Picking MySQL is not an expensive thing. But if I exercise that option, all of a sudden it's expensive, right? I have to do, move 100 gigs or a terabyte or petabyte or whatever it is, right? So that's sort of what I'll call sort of optional data portability or one-time data portability. I think that's pretty easy. Most people, if you pick a set of relatively standard services, great. If you're running Kubernetes and you're storing data in MySQL and Memcache, you have that. It's pretty easy to migrate that, right? I think then if you go one click further and say, I want real-time, right, data portability, right? I want to be able to write to my Google Cloud instance and have it real-time replicate to Amazon. Now you're getting into a much higher cost. Now you're saying, I need a truly cloud native Cassandra maybe type architecture. I'm running active. I'm constantly double paying for bandwidth and things to do this sort of real-time replication. But that's kind of like the next click over. I think past that then is really around what we call workflow portability, which is I want a consistent, let's call it CI/CD pipeline for how I take my app out to cloud, whether that's Google, whether that's Amazon, right? That tends to be where HashiCorp and friends play, right? It was like, great, I might pick, Terraform and Kubernetes. I can build a common pipeline where I say, I go through the CI/CD thing, it packages a container, it lands on a kube, whether it's GKE or EKS. I can have a consistent way of app delivery, right? I think that next layer up becomes truly workload portability, which is this idea of today I'm deploying that app to Google. Now I want to switch gear and deploy it into AWS, the same app, right? I think this is getting closer to the extreme end of what Richard's spectrum was. And I think the challenge to actually really do that is like, okay, but what if you're using any sticky service, right? You're using Stackdriver. Yeah. Okay, well, how do you move from using Stackdriver in Google to, there isn't a good equivalent for that in Amazon all of a sudden, right? So now you really have to architect around truly everything portable, no sticky dependencies. Cloud is a commodity. To Spencer's point, it's sort of a difficult view to architect against that. And then the most extreme, I think, is that the panacea view, which is I push a button, I migrate it, I just change my DNS traffic routes, and like everything just works. And I think to achieve that, you kind of need all of the other prerequisites. Your data is active replicated across site. You have workflow portability. You have workload portability and no sticky dependencies, right? You can just turn this knob. And I think the cost of architecting for that, the cost of the infrastructure to be able to have that optionality is immense. You might need it, right? If you're a bank and you have a regulatory requirement, they're like, too bad, you have to do it. Okay, great, you have no choice. But I think most people don't need to live in that world of sort of crazy cost and complexity.
Yeah. So Richard, where do you start on this journey? Some great points here. What are your thoughts on if you want to, I don't know, strangle the unicloud? How do you go about this?
Such a vivid image, Wes. Yeah, I mean, even to Armin's point, you kind of both alluded to it, but I mean, multi-region is hard. Like, pick just GCP, AWS, Azure. How many people are even running in more than one region? Like, that's hard, right? Replication, latency, data duplication, deployment consistency, drift. Like, start with that. Like, don't start multi-cloud, probably. That's probably a terrible idea. Now, Armin, you mentioned the point of startups. I mean, startups, look, some are going to use BigQuery for analytics. Others like using Lambda at the same place. And they're using Twilio, and they're using Confluent Cloud. So arguably everybody's multi-cloud because no one's finding all the services with a single public cloud provider. So when I think of starting, you're already going to be doing it. Even when you just start with a single cloud, you're dipping into other managed services in the cloud. But like, I wouldn't start multi-cloud. That's probably not from an IaaS perspective, or not like a cloud application services. Start multi-region. Like, learn the difficulty of provisioning consistently across regions. I have Terraform up on my Visual Studio Code right now, building out Anthos clusters because it makes my life easier. Like, learn some of the foundational tooling to even get multi-region working, and deployment consistency and operational consistency. Then get a little bold and brave and say, all right, well, let me add a GCP region here. Let me add this here. Then all of a sudden it's not so scary. But trying to pick up a cloud when you haven't even done distributed systems in a cloud is probably a recipe for failure.
Yeah, sure. Bastian, anything you want to add? Any thoughts?
No, I totally agree, and that pretty much is the picture that we went through. Like we when I joined Instana, we just had one single simple region. Then we had a migration to a different operational stack at that point. Then we expanded to 2 regions in one cloud, and now we are running over several clouds. And I can only totally agree what you said, Richard. It's every step in this way comes with its own problems and its own difficulties you have to solve. And I think it would be a bad idea to try to start multi-cloud from the get-go. That said, however, I think it's maybe not bad to have it in the back of your head in terms of how you build your architecture, because some errors you might make are hard to build back once you're big enough.
And I think maybe just adding on to sort of that thought, I think there is some amount of sort of upfront thinking, I think, that can save you a lot of sort of pain, right? Sort of the ounce of prevention worth a pound of cure type of thing. So I think if you know that at some point you're going to go multi-cloud, multi-region, right? I think some of those upfront decisions that actually do make sense are things like, okay, if I know I'm going to pick AWS and Google, right? What are the set of common services? At least if I can constrain myself to those, then I know, okay, great. That changes my optionality in a way that if I had said I'm going all in on, DynamoDB and Spanner, you've built yourself into a cul-de-sac that's going to be very difficult to then architect back out of. So I think there are some of those kind of, to your point, architectural decisions that you can make early on that you're like, okay, great, I've preserved optionality at least. I might not use it. I might decide I don't need to go multi-cloud, but it's a lot easier if you're not sort of all in on a technology that's not portable.
Where do you draw the line, though? Premature optimization is the root of all evil, right? So where do you say this is a decision that I should make multi-cloud, this is not, something I should just punt for later? How do you really know that right now in your journey?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think the policy we take internally is sort of take a hard look at what we think the cost of rewrite would be. And what I mean by that is if we have a service that's using Aurora, let's just say, you're like, okay, by and large, if you squint, it's MySQL compatible. Sure, Aurora has certain features and things, limitations specific to Amazon, but there is a path off of Aurora if we need to that's not horrendous, right? Versus if we said Dynamo, you're like, okay, it's such a specific object model, API model, right, execution model that a migration off of Dynamo is almost an app rewrite, right, to deal with that. So I think that's where we kind of look at it and say, okay, great, can we draw these lines? We said maybe document DB, for example, that's okay because great, it's sort of Mongo equivalent. You could migrate to Mongo, fine. But I think that's kind of how we sort of think about it internally.
Yeah, it's a great answer. Adet, you do a lot with customers that are having to deal with these problems. You see most people are really invested in multi-cloud or a single cloud, uni-cloud. What are strategies that are working? Is this we need to go service mesh? What's actually working when people have multi-clouds?
Yeah, so let's think kind of I wanted to iterate what Armand said, which you said it very right. If you're thinking about what is cloud today, there is, we should go to computer basic, right? It's basically compute, it's networking, and it's storage, and some services and monitoring and tool to help you, right? So let's look at the three ones that we have. The first one is compute. I think that we did a very good job with abstracting it, right? I think Kubernetes is doing a very good job of doing it. And, I kind of feel with that and other tools like Terraform and others, we kind of get that, right? Then there is the traffic and the storage. The storage, it's not going to go away. As Armand said, we try. There's so many, I was in EMC before, I can tell you, there's so many people who's trying to solve this problem. That's just a very big problem to solve. Eventually, the only good way to do this is take all this bunch of kind of this and move them to another, physically by trucks to another, right? If you're looking at the Netflix of the world, they're totally locked down. There is no other way for them to move all this giant data, and there's nothing we can do about it. So first of all, let's be aware of it, right? It doesn't matter what, this is something that will lock you to a specific cloud, right? So that's number one. But then there is the traffic. And the question is, did we actually abstract the traffic? And I'm selling service mesh, can tell you that that's where we're going with, right? That's what we're trying to do, the connectivity between the cloud. But I will be honest with you, it's also expensive, right? I mean, if I'm running right now in one cluster on the same time and one service want to talk in the third cluster and have exactly the same service in the different cloud, physically, I will not want to do this because it will take me more time to get there. And latency is extremely important when you're talking about application. So just to be fair, what we see in a lot of places is sometimes I I would try first, it's what we're calling routing based on localization, right? Where are you? What is the region? And then I will fail over to do it. And until you're actually going to get to fail over to a multi-cloud, to be honest, you will have a lot of fallbacks before because you want it to be fast. You want it, latency is extremely important. So on the three things that we are kind of like talking about, compute, awesome, we totally solve. And I'm talking about solving, when we're talking about services, to be honest, we didn't solve Lambda, right? And serverless, which that kind of like logging you to the provider again. And then there is the storage. We didn't solve it. I don't think we will, to be honest. This is a very physical problem that I don't know how we can about doing it. And then the last one is connectivity, that we can allow that, as worst case, you can go to the close one, go to the very far one, but it's worth it. You will not solve that as well. So as I said, our solution is multi-cloud. You can group mesh it between, STO on-prem and app mesh in AWS and kind of like bring them as one entity of virtual mesh. You still eventually will prefer to stay on the same boundary because of the latency. And I think that that's something, and so forget about security, latency. I think that's something that is really, really critical.
Yeah, Armin, you know a thing or two about service meshes, I hear. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with it, Deep, in the sense that, latency is the great killer of a lot of these things, right? We haven't found a way to defeat physics yet. I think the other piece, maybe I'll add in terms of, thinking about kind of compute, storage, network. I think even as we think about, the networking layer as, do we have a common abstraction? To me, I think there's a bigger challenge, which is the clouds and on-prems all have different mental models for this stuff, right? I think what you see on-prem is great. Maybe we went all in on Cisco gear and used Palo Alto firewalls and you had sort of network fabrics and VLANs and whatever. Great. You try and translate that to cloud now. And you're like, it's not equivalent, right? They have a different notion of security groups and VNets and VPCs and things like that, where you're like, all of a sudden you're like, okay, how do I, fit this back into my on-prem network model? And then as you go cross-cloud provider, they're all different slightly, right? It's not like fundamentally different. You squint and all get same abstractions, but they're just different enough, right? That you're like, okay, there's no way for me to easily say this Amazon VPC can talk to this Google VPC, or this security group can talk to this Azure VNet, right? Like once you start crossing those network boundaries, it just becomes a complete and utter nightmare mess, basically, right? Because effectively what you have is each cloud is running an SDN. It's all software-defined networking, but they're all completely incompatible with one another, right? They have no notion of each other's identity and, sort of primitives that kind of build up those networks. So I think this is, in our mind, one of the biggest motivators for why service mesh, right? I think when we talk about it, again, to me, it goes back to that fragmentation question of how do I rationalize the fact that I have 4 different network models, right? Between Amazon, Google, Azure, and on-prem. It's really almost saying, we're going to abandon the network model from the physical layer. You're like, in some sense, I don't care that I have VLANs over here and VPCs over there. I'm going to move it to sort of a service mesh layer. I'm going to click it one level up and just treat my network as a dumb bit pipe, right? Like I don't care about what my, security groups are, my VPCs, et cetera. It's a dumb bit pipe. As long as the bits flow, I'm going to solve it at a logical layer with the service mesh, where I'll bring application identity in, manage sort of the traffic routing and rules at that layer. And that gives me sort of a networking abstraction where now I'm not sort of battling the sort of fragmentation and kind of inconsistencies of these SDN models. So I think to me that's probably one of the most compelling reasons to think about service mesh is how do you rationalize these SDNs that otherwise don't speak to one another, don't interoperate with one another, is sort of ignore them to a large extent, sort of treat it like a dumb network, push it up a level, and then sort of rationalize. But to Edith's point, let's be really, really careful about what our motivation is. If our motivation is I'm going to have an app call from, Amazon to Google to on-prem and back to the user, like, yeah, your latency is going to be outrageous, right? So that hopefully that's not your use case. If it's more about, hey, there's these selective cases where I'm crossing these boundaries and I want a rational security model and a rational networking model, yeah, that's actually a really good use case for these things where you're paying the latency cost anyways. But now how do you do it in a way that you're not losing your mind managing firewall policy?
Yeah, absolutely. Richard, I want to get your thoughts here on service mesh, but before I do, you come from a major cloud provider. And so I'm curious, you've got to get this question that kind of Armin talked about as he was talking, that if we're, I think, I'm looking for my notes, but AWS, EKS Anywhere, Anthos, right? We're getting these things from some of the providers. Are we just shipping kind of the constructs of that particular cloud provider and now bringing it on-prem or in other locations when we're doing this? How do you answer the question that Armin just kind of brought up about how every cloud provider has a slightly different way of rationalizing certain aspects of the cloud?
I mean, that's the management challenge, right? Tenancy is wildly different in each one. How do you segment tenants? How do you get access? Identity models, API surfaces, SDKs, like that's the sort of underrated part of multi-cloud. As mentioned, you can grab a Postgres database and a K8s cluster in every cloud. Like that's not the hard part. The hard part's figuring out AWS IAM or how do GCP projects work and things like that. So part of what I think, whether it's an EKS Anywhere, what we're doing with Anthos is taking some of our model. Now we're trying to do it all with open source tech, Istio, Knative, Kubernetes, things like that. So that surface is at least similar, but I mean, let's be honest, everything has a lock-in component. Like at some point, you just have to embrace the fact that everything is lock-in. Java's lock-in, Kubernetes is lock-in, my marriage is lock-in. It's all switching costs, right? And value. Like if I'm getting value from the thing, go all in on Lambda. I don't care. If you're getting a ton of value from it, yeah, maybe it's a rewrite. You're not planning to rewrite. Or same with Cloud Run or same with BigQuery. Like at some point, architecting for extreme portability is a waste of your time. That if your whole goal is better business outcomes through software, I got to make some bets. And so hard part is where, and I think the service mesh is going to be an interesting one. I'm not super smart on service mesh. I've been late to finally get the religion. I think I have it now. But like that seems like maybe that's like one of those good layers you do bet on that says like, let's actually, this is a normalization layer, but let's not try to normalize everything else because we're going to do that and we're not going to ship value for 2 years while we build some magical multi-cloud platform that's now out of date the second it's available. Like at some point, that's not the value. So what is the simplest thing you can do that's maintainable? Do that. And if it involves lock-in and you want to use Dynamo, awesome. Dynamo's terrific. Use Bigtable, use whatever. And then just pick maybe a few strategic things that should be cross-cutting, that should be portable. So yeah, bet on Terraform, bet on Istio, bet on a handful of things, and then just ship good software so you actually stay in business long enough to do the next version.
Yep. Bastian, go ahead.
Oh, sure. I was just going to add, which is like, I totally agree. And I think this goes back to that, when we talked about that kind of framework, it's like not architecting for workload portability unless you absolutely have to, I think is just like, it's the same recommendation. It's like,
that's a great phrase.
If you have to, okay. But otherwise, yeah, it's like, I totally agree with Richard. It's like the business value case is really hard to justify there. It's like, you're way better off being like, just go use whatever, Cloud Run and, Spanner and call it a day and don't worry about it.
Bastian, from observability, from SRE, from thinking about multi-cloud and kind of having to troubleshoot things and to interact and keep things reliable as services are operating. What thoughts do you have with multi-cloud and service mesh?
I'm also not too smart on service mesh, so I can't add a lot there. But I think it really a lot of it has to go into your application, into how you engineer your application. What sort of mechanisms you build in, what sort of failover mechanisms or load shedding mechanisms your software has, what sort of metrics you expose. Maybe you do distributed tracing, you add some open tracing tags, whatever. So at least a part of observability has to happen in the engineering process. And I think after that, it really depends which route you want to go. In our case, it's very easy because we are an observability tool company, so we use ourselves to observe us in all the different clouds we use.
Det, same question. What's the role of observability with multi-cloud and service meshes?
So let's talk 1 second about service mesh, because I think that in this panel, we kind of like move it to a multi-cloud. And this is kind of like the side effect, but that's not the reason service meshes exist, right? Service mesh is actually started because people adopted microservices environment. They thought that they can go faster. There was a solution for organization problem, right? I had a lot of team contributing to the same source code. I need to separate that somehow to get them autonomic. And then the service mesh came to bring it all together. So when we're talking about observability, the thing that I'm looking at service mesh is that the special thing that service mesh is doing is basically taking out the operation code like observability, like security, like routing, basically outside of the application code, right? It's abstracting. And I think this is the power. It's just understand, we basically abstract all the network in that point. And I think that, again, we can leverage it on multi-cloud, of course, and I can tell you because that's what we're doing, right? But that's not, we have a lot of customers that started with the process of, crawl, run, walk, run, fly, right? Starting with a simple cluster, they just want to see what's going on inside the cluster, right? That's the simple thing that they want. And they wanted to go and say, okay, now we need to kind of like more maybe security on the edge, maybe developer portal to kind of like share it to other people. Then we're moving to the run one, which basically saying, okay, now I want to put it in my organization. I need a workflow, an approval process. So I need to see how it's that fit. And only the run, right, is basically, okay, now I need to run a multi-cluster, multi-cloud, right? How do we do this? And I will bring all the tools that we did for this all the way there. And that's what we're doing, right? So if you're looking at this, I mean, I can name a lot of customers that we have. And what we see is they're running over 100 cluster in the production, different cloud and so on. But again, in the nutshell, that's what Service Mesh is solving. And the multi-cloud is just a nice benefit.
Yeah, it's a good point. Yeah, we shouldn't try to insinuate that it's there to solve a multi-cloud problem. It's there to let developers focus on the business logic and not the plumbing and between services for those kind of communications. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. All right, so we are coming up on about 3 minutes now before the end, so it's kind of short. Sorry, didn't mean to cut you off. I want to give everybody an opportunity to kind of give your parting thought. So we spent 45 minutes, 43 minutes together. In just a few words, I'm going to start with you, Richard. We'll kind of go around that same room as we started. What are your parting thoughts? If someone is, purchased another company and they're multi-cloud, what are your thoughts for them to address this reality they're now in?
Yeah, if we assume it's inevitable, look, your primary cloud choice probably lasts as long as your CIO does. Keep switching a lot. Right? Like that's what's happening right now, let alone maybe you're multi-cloud because you made your primary cloud so hard to use. If you're an IT team, loosen up a bit, right? Because your teams are using other clouds because the primary has too much process and procedure behind it. So if you're an IT team, loosen up a little bit. If you're a dev team, think about the right architecture that's going to prepare you for these sort of distributed systems. Pick a few foundational things that are going to matter and don't overinvest in upfront and portability. Always keep your focus on speed and maintainability.
Well said. Bastian?
I can only agree. Pick the right abstractions in the beginning, but start small and then take it step by step, as we heard with the example before, like region, 2 regions, 2 clouds, like one thing after the other.
Okay, Adette?
Yes, I mean, I think that Richard said it nice. In the natural competition is driving innovation. And I think that the fact that we have a lot of cloud that's competing right now with the on-prem solution, it's actually fantastic because they force them to keep up. And I think that this is actually very interesting. So to me, as I said, like as the other, I would just force is like always know where you want to go. What is the vision? What do you want to go? And ideally, you want to go to abstraction of everything. I'm not locked to anything and everything is great. But build only what you need right now, right? Abstract, create an interface for that, but build only what you need right now and then know where you're going. And I think it's been said very well.
Yeah, very nice. And finally, last but not least, Armin?
Yeah, I mean, I would just add to maybe what Edith was saying, which is I think what we often see is a lot of customers end up sort of, I'll call it sleepwalking into multi-cloud. It's not really done with any intentionality. So I think probably my biggest advice is like, be really intentional. And what I mean by that is like, have a solid understanding about what's the motivation, what's the goal, what's the outcome you're trying to achieve. I think in some cases, if you say, yeah, our goal is the regulator says we have to be able to do this full failover. Okay, great. From that goal, maybe you figure out that you actually do need to architect for true workload portability. And okay, that's going to constrain your design and your thinking. But if you start and you say, okay, my goal is actually just, I have some, credits that I got from Oracle Cloud, and so I should also be using those. Okay, so then, don't kill yourself in terms of, workload portability. Just figure out what's a viable set of workloads that you can consume those credits, and you can have a much more reasoned approach to what you're doing from your multi-cloud. So I think just starting with understanding what the goal and constraints are, let you be a lot more intentional about it rather than, to Richard's earlier point of kind of immediately gravitating to these sort of extreme views where it's like most likely you don't need to fall into one of those, right? So kind of figuring out what are you actually solving for and being very intentional about it.
I did a podcast a while back and specifically talked about constraints being enabling because it gives you a box to actually work in rather than greenfield and being just completely wide open. All right, so we are at time. Thomas, I just saw your question, so I missed it. I will send this to the group and follow up with you afterward to get your question answered. Apologize for missing that. Thank you all for attending this panel on multi-cloud. We have about a 10-minute break and then I think 15-minute break. Then I think there is another session right after that on bracing production. So thank you all for joining us on this panel.
Thanks so much, Wes.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.
Thank you.